Okay, well, it is 9:30, so this Newham planning examination here is open. The agenda for today obviously was published last week and then it was updated yesterday to add the participants. The reason I ordered it as it was to try and break it into sections, but so that people could come and go as suited. And I thought I'd put the Gypsy Traveller accommodation on first, on the assumption that the Gypsy Traveller group may wish to attend again, but they haven't been in touch with Charlotte. I don't know if the council's been in touch with them. They've been in touch with you at all? No. So they're not here. I've got a few questions about the proposed modification. So we'll deal with that first, and then we'll have a break until 10:30, because obviously I did say that we wouldn't start the subsequent discussions until 10:30. And then the other break in the agenda was for affordable housing and viability of the final of the issues on the agenda to be done not before 2 o'clock. Again, for the same reason, in case anybody was wishing to discuss some of those issues. Or I suspect probably the other participants who are listed will probably be here from 10:30, but we will stick to those timings. I think the GLA are actually only coming this afternoon, so that will suit them. Anyway, so the other sort of introductory things that I'm going to deal with, I'll wait until 10:30. But just to say, actually, two things. I'll say it again when others are here. First of all, we've got the revised statement of common ground related to Vector Riverside, document DD22, which has been signed in an amended form by TfL. So we will deal with that under the Vector Riverside agenda item under site allocations, along with the other more limited issues I had. So we'll deal with that then. I don't think TfL are coming, but we've obviously got their positions set out reasonably clearly in the amended statement of common ground. And then the other issue, which I'll mention when others are here, but it was my note on, I think it was probably on Friday, which was about the forthcoming regulations under the LURA and the implications for SPD being adopted into the current legislation, which seems to say that it will not be possible to adopt SPD under the 2004 Act and regulations after the end of June this year. So you've responded to that, and I think it's what I expected. That I don't think there's any implications for this plan, so that's fine. But I'll just mention it again when others are here, just in case anyone's got any about that. Fine. Some of the plans and examination may be more significant than SPD. Okay. So unless there's any other queries you've got, let's look at policy H10, the modifications to that. So there's been 2 rounds of modifications now. There was the ones that we discussed twice, really, actually, because we had a session just with the council, then we had a session with the London Gypsy Traveller group, and then we've got subsequent modifications, which reflect essentially the more recent evidence prepared by the GLA that provides new information about the assessment of needs in Newham and elsewhere. So you've looked at that, and you've looked at what ORS did for you, and you've come up with this figure of now 39 between 2027,
yes.
2027 and 2037.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is made up of. So it's just I haven't looked at the GLA, the RRR report, but they used ORS's work and integrated into that.
Yes. So they use that for to base the need for gypsy travellers on our existing site, where they undertook quite recent field work.
Yeah.
So that was part of the RRR study, and then the second part was looking at gypsies travellers currently in bricks and mortar that would like to move to a pitch, and it's sort of seeing our response, but kind of the need figure that I calculated for the second part is a composite of the growth from need arising from the existing site, and then the growth arising from the gypsies travellers in bricks and mortar housing on pitch.
So in simple terms, the amount of need from the existing site is what?
Oh God, I think it's about.
It's less than 23. It's most of 23, I think it was.
Yes, it is. Yeah, I think it's.
It doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, in terms of the 22 to 32, it's about 70 pitches, but that's not including the growth from the extra 5 years, which I think is about 2 or 3 pitches, something like that. So it's about 20, I think, in total.
Yeah. So roughly half of the 39
Yeah.
arises from the existing site.
Yes.
Known needs from those people.
Yes.
And the rest is an estimate of people needs arising from people who aren't on an existing pitch.
Yes.
Basically, so it's about 50-50, which I think is just. Yeah. So in terms of the needs from the existing site, obviously you propose a modification to extend it.
Yes.
Policy allows intensification and extension, but that's the estimate is could provide 5 more pitches. Yes. So that still leaves a significant need for 15 more around pitches for the people living there and children growing up there, or whatever. Yeah. And then the other 20 or so need where they would want to be or who they want to be with, we just don't know really, do we? Because they're people living in different parts of the borough. Okay, right, understood. Okay, so the policy, the plan will be modified to reflect that. Whether it would be helpful to give an indication of that sort of rough split.
Yeah, no, we could do that.
It has sort of locational implications, doesn't it, in some respects? So that's potentially something imminently essential. Okay, and then it brings us on to the provision in the plan. So obviously there's a modification proposed to extend the existing site, as we've discussed, and then we have, this is the third time we've touched on this, is the council's process of identifying. So basically what's happened was that the call for sites, private sector land, nothing has been identified as being available and suitable. So the council's been looking at its land holdings, going through its corporate process. And it's basically what you're saying, you haven't got to a position where you could say these sites are suitable and available.
Yes.
And it's a mixture of the availability and suitability, because there are some of the sites that have got issues that still need to be resolved.
Yes.
And the availability is something that is not just a planning issue, it's a corporate issue that, I suppose, like any landholder, it's as a planning authority, it may be that you can identify land as being suitable, but there are other considerations that the council would take into account, which is understood. So I think, the question is, you've described a team structure and it's progressing the work. So what's the sort of timescale for that process?
I think initially what they're looking at doing is some additional feasibility work, because some of these sites were initially looked at for general needs housing, but they weren't taken forward because there were some issues on the site. I think primarily with heights on a few of them,
right?
Which is obviously less of an issue with the Gypsy and Traveller community. But at the moment, Naomi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're looking to organise a kind of initial meeting with the Gypsy and Traveller community to kind of set out the work programme. But they're looking at initially, I think, some flood risk additional work, and then also some feasibility around this railway works. How long that will take, I think it's I don't know exactly how long those studies usually.
They're looking to meet relatively soon, because initially it was going to be 3 weeks after we met them before Christmas, but we've gone back to the community to say that some more work's going to be done, just so that they've got something to present to the group that's realistic to have a discussion about whether or not they're suitable. But it is a mayoral priority. She understands the need for the local plan, but also for the community. She was at that meeting before Christmas. So there is momentum with the team structure and with our corporate director to progress the work. But we don't have a fixed timeline beyond that next meeting to discuss those sites.
But it's ongoing, and would you expect to reach conclusion through this ongoing process? It's not something that's sort of going to reach a sort of a technical feasibility and then that's it, being put on a shelf. It's something that will resolve one way or the other.
Yeah.
In the coming months or over this year or whatever.
Yes.
So when you say the community, are you talking about the group that was represented?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we've met with London Gypsies and Travellers, and then also I think as part of this work that our regen team have taken on, they're also looking at doing some work with, I think, the community on Parkway Crescent as well, and with London Gypsies and Travellers around allocations policy for Gypsy and Traveller sites, because we've not delivered new pitches since we delivered the Parkway Crescent site. So there'll be a discussion with the community as a wider group, I think, to kind of understand like how need is prioritised and who gets allocated a pitch.
Yeah. So that means if you do identify councillor unstacked and you wish to push it forward, then the next complicated issue to sort out is the prioritisation of
exactly.
people. Yeah. Okay. Understood. Right. And in terms of GLA's position in all this, they've done that work. That will feed into the review of the London plan.
It will, yes.
That potentially could. But if you've had a recently adopted plan and then accepting Newham's figure is 39 and it takes account of that evidence, well, I suppose that's a fairly solid starting point for the GLA.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know what the overall picture in London is, but obviously, unless you've got a significant need arising from an existing settled community, but also people in bricks and mortar housing, and you've got limited capacity that you're trying to do. So, it's not as if you're going to be pointed to necessarily as an authority that's got lots of spare capacity for this sort of development.
Our view has been, and it's statement of common ground that we've got with GLA, that there needs to be, more of a strategic view of how this need is addressed, because they've sort of, I know that sort of there have been issues raised with it, but I think the GLA have sort of acted to try and do a more comprehensive view of need. We think accompanying that should be a more comprehensive look at land availability as well to meet that need.
But essentially, I suppose you're using the most up-to-date, best evidence there is and what the need is in Europe, seeking to do what you can to meet that. Okay, so that brings us on to, obviously I've heard the position. I can reach a view on that in terms of what the plan does and doesn't do. In terms of the policy, it basically is supportive of this development subject to certain criteria, and the criteria are essentially not unduly restrictive, I don't suppose, because they're only restricting things that are fairly absolute. I agree about mole, flood risk, highway safety. Then the last clause is about, we've talked about this before, which is about providing access to services. But it's not, there's no absolute sort of restriction in that. It's just seeking to ensure that there's a reasonable accessibility.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just, to make sure that, I think there's a clause in there about sort of undertaking engagement with the community about the suitability of new sites coming forward. And I guess that clause was sort of, from my perspective, it was looking to link into that, just making sure that, the community's happy that there's, adequate access to services. And I think in a borough like Newham, it would probably be rare that wasn't the case, because most of the borough is pretty well connected public transport wise. So I can't see that being an issue moving forward.
It's not exactly an isolated rural location.
No,
it's
exactly.
going to be brought forward.
Yeah.
No. Okay. Right, understood. Okay, right. So I don't think I've got any more questions about that. We've got to where we are. We've got the modifications. There's one slight consideration about description of the breakdown of the need, how it relates to different components we talked about. But other than that, I don't think there's anything else we can talk about today. So, is there anything else you wish to say? No. Okay. Right. So we'll have a break until 10:30 when we'll sort of start from the part one policies. In terms of the finalised statement of common ground, I've got it. You've got it, obviously, and the other parties, William and Aberdeen Investment. And it's published as well. Thank you. There we go. Answer that. Okay, so everything's very right. Okay, thank you. Let's break now and we'll come back. Okay, well, excuse me. Good morning, everyone. It is now 10:30, so we'll carry on with this, resume this hearing session. We started at 9:30 briefly. As I think you all know, I'm William Fieldhouse, the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the plan. Can you hear me okay back there? Yeah, okay. A reminder, please, if everyone could switch their mobile phones, laptops to silent. No fire alarm tests planned for today, so if the alarm does go off, we will need to evacuate the building, out through the doors, round left, and then out through the way you came in, past reception, and congregate at the far end of the building behind me. The agenda for today was published last Wednesday and updated yesterday to include the participants. So we're basically just revisiting some of the issues we've already talked about during the examination, and specifically the Council's responses to some of my action points, particularly from week 4, which were published last week, document ED20A, which I assume you've seen. So we've got 3 main blocks to it. Part 1, policies, which we're about to look at. There's a few of those, but I don't have very many questions. I don't think they would take that long, but it's an opportunity for others to comment on those if they wish. We'll then have a very short break before we look at the action points relating to some of the site allocations that are listed on the agenda. And then we will break for lunch and come back to look at affordable housing, which I did say wouldn't be before 2 o'clock in case there were people who wish to come to deal with that and the implications that the proposed changes may have to the viability evidence and findings related to the plan. Okay, so I hope that's clear. As usual, I'll start with a few questions to the Council, although I don't have all that many questions on the Part 1 policies because they're issues that we've already covered. If you do wish to speak, obviously on any of those, please just put your name plate vertically in the usual way, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate time. As has been the case following the first 4 weeks of hearings, I'll probably do a note if there are any outstanding actions following this session today. And at the end of today, I will just say a few words about the next steps in the examination. The Council's schedule of proposed potential modifications, ED20, was updated again last week. So the version on the website is the comprehensive. I think it was reformatted. It was updated on Friday, then reformatted yesterday. Yeah, but the reformatting didn't substantially change the content. It was just, yeah, okay. So we've got that. And we'll have a chat about what happens next with that at the end of today. 2 things I'll just mention before we go around the table to introduce ourselves. First, 2 things that have been published in the last day or so. First one, the Statement of Common Ground relating to Beckton Riverside, document ED22, as was ED22A, as is now, with TfL signatures. So there's an area of disagreement identified in that updated version. So we will look at that later this morning under the Beckton Riverside allocation item when we come to that. TfL aren't here. We don't think we're expecting them. So we've got what they've inserted into that document. So we can talk about that. And the other thing I'll just mention, I'll deal with very quickly shortly, was I published a note, well, not published it, it was Friday, I think Friday or yesterday even, and which is about the LURA regulations that are forthcoming and implications for supplementary planning documents being adopted under the current 2004 Act and regulations, which I'll just have a quick word about shortly and see if anyone else has got any comments they wish to say about that. So before we turn to that, can we go around the table and let people introduce themselves, starting with the Council?
Naomi Pomfret, Principal Planner for the London Borough of Newham.
Antonia Mariano, Principal Planner.
Lily Mahoney, Principal Planner of Newham.
Dahlia Edman, Interim Planning Policy Manager at Newham. Lawrence.
James Campery, Senior Planner. Ben Ford, Senior Director of Ford, advising St William on East Ham.
Ford, at St William. Rebecca Barnes, Planning Director for Ford here on St William.
Simon Lewis, Planning and Director for St William.
Matt Berry from Block Planning, behalf of United Students.
Julian Stevenson, Montague Douglas on behalf of Aberdeen.
Ramona Kibdu, Planning Manager from LDC.
Okay, welcome all. Any queries, procedural queries, questions from anyone before I just start and go through these various bullet points relating to Part 1 policies? So just before we look at the action point relating to the information requirements, the note that I published, having become aware of the forthcoming, this was something actually that was announced by the government last year, I think, which was brought to my attention last week. I thought, well, I'm going to ask about this just in case there are any implications for the council, which essentially seems to be saying, as my reading of what the government has said and what the regulations will do when they're brought in, will mean that no local authorities will be able to adopt supplementary planning documents under the 2004 Act, 2012 regulations, after the 30th of June this year. So, assuming that those regulations are expected to be published shortly, I understand. So, if that is the case, question to the council: well, does that have any implications for this authority and this plan? So, you just want to very briefly just respond to that.
Yeah, so no, there is no sort of implications for the plan, as we set out that, we've got a plan, it's going to be submitted in time before the new planning system, the new local plan system takes in effect. And if we are to submit any supplementary plans, there'll be further guidance as to how we do that. So no implications for the local plan at the moment and its policies. And of course, the implementation texts have guidance as to how to implement and deliver the policies. So we don't think there's any implications for the plan.
Okay. Some plans have policies that that refer to forthcoming SPD or further guidance going to be produced through SPD. This plan, I don't think, has any instances. So there isn't anything in this plan that indicates its effectiveness is dependent on forthcoming SPD.
Yeah.
So that's understood. I don't know what the legislation will mean for plans adopted under the 2004 Act and whether local authorities can adopt new style, what's it called, supplementary plans in relation to a 2004 plan. I don't know. But I mean, I think in this case, you say it doesn't matter because the policies in this plan are self-contained.
Yeah.
I suppose you could also say it vindicates the approach that you've taken in including what some could see as SPD actually in the plan in the form of implementation text. So obviously a very forward-looking council anticipating what the government was about to do. So congratulations on that. Any questions from anyone else in relation to that? No, okay, thank you. Right, so we'll just go down this list. As I said, I don't have many questions about these. First one was things we talked about in various ways at various different sessions about the plans, policies, and when they refer to various information requirements, whether it's in the form of a strategy, evidence, or whatever else. And when right at the beginning, the council identified, yes, there are about 60 instances of this, but it said, well, they're not 60 new things that the council's looking for, and we discussed this sometimes. Anyway, the council now proposed a modification to clarify that in the most cases these are bits of information that the planning application would be providing as part of a more mainstream evidence document, whether it's an access statement, a planning statement, or whatever else. So I think that's clear. Any comments from anyone else about that? No? Okay, thank you. So the next item was action points 41, 42 and 43, and these are all just about the clarifying the status of policies and diagrams, etc. in the plan, which again we've spoken about on a number of occasions. So I don't think I have any further questions. I mean, the action point arose last time was about the illustrative diagrams specifically, and explaining that they're one way of achieving an outcome, and that the co-design master planning process could indicate that another way of achieving it would also be. So you've included that, and you've included an extra sentence just to explain that a little bit further. Anything you want to say on that? No? Any queries from anyone else? Aberdeen?
Yeah. Yes, there's been quite a lot of toing and froing since the last hearing. We've made a huge amount of progress, particularly in terms of the main wording of those 5 parts. We've submitted further request for additional wording relating to BFN 2.1, which should be before you, so if it's not, we can just issue that. It just ties in solely to the point we've discussed on a number of different occasions relating to different parts on phasing, just to have that explained and put in explicitly at the back end of part 1. And then the second part, the only other substantive point is there is to recognise where master planning has been undertaken, proposals may be brought forward. So that's more of a consistency point with what we may be talking about later in terms of N17 SA1.
Yes, okay.
So,
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so the council's modification to part 1 of BFN 2
Yes.
deleted references to piecemeal. Yeah.
Yep.
And
All agreed, sir.
sorry?
All agreed, sir.
Yeah, all agreed. But there was some further tweak to that modification
Yes.
that you were wishing to make.
Yes, sir. We just wanted to add one single sentence, which was phased development that follows a design-led approach, which is consistent with the wording elsewhere,
Yeah.
will be supported. So it's just more just a wrapping up the wording of policy to reflect other parts.
Okay. So, William,
We ran out of time, unfortunately, to discuss that at the back end of last week with Newham.
yeah, okay. Well, I'll ask the council if they wish to comment on that. So, William.
So those comments were joint between both parties, so would echo what Julian just saying. There was one other comment that we had in the amendments, which was to part 4 relating to the Newham youth strategy. Again, welcome the amendment, but we were looking for wording along the lines of where it is feasible to do so. We previously explained that Newham uses can only be delivered on a site where it's safe to deliver them, particularly in the context of gas works, like it's fairly minor amend something that gives some sort of acknowledgement to that would be helpful.
That's the one about part 4. Base science, the modification would say, meanwhile, use strategy, which will outline how those parts will be safely activated through appropriate meanwhile uses without prejudicing safety at the delivery of the permanent scheme. And that's about where feasible do so.
Yeah.
Qualification. Okay, understood. Do you want to, Councillor, do you want to comment on those two things?
Sorry, there's the other one, sir, was part 2.
I'm sorry, yeah, go on.
So which is also a joint statement between us and Sweden as well, where we wanted to add in the extra wording as a second sentence, where master planning has been undertaken, proposals may be brought forward. So just to making sure it's back to back. So that's also set out in that joint statement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All right, so 3 points there. Want to comment on those?
Yes. So in relation to the first part, that policy part is intended to function across any kind of site, not just site allocations. So in that sense, our existing policy in the existing local plan has been used effectively even on small scale sites that have been phased, and where development management have felt the need for the process to better integrate in the wider context of the site. So that part 1, we feel does not need to link to phasing because it needs to support wider development options. And then in terms of design-led approach, that's already signposted across the plan and applied holistically. It would not be missed, obviously. So in relation to specifically policy D3, we feel there is no need for this policy part to also mention the design-led approach. Having said that, in terms of phasing and the process of master planning itself, there have been some proposals put forward by both St. William and Aberdeen that we think, not in the exact wording provided, but we might be able to agree on for part 2, because it relates specifically to the master planning process sense. So going to, would it help to read out what I thought?
Yeah,
or that could be an action point.
I think it may be easier to leave it for you to talk to the parties. I think, it's not a big deal. It's a matter of tying things together if necessary. So understood that. So the phasing and master planning design-led approach, you've seen the comments from Aberdeen and your view about how they fit into parts 1 and 2. So I'll leave that, I think, as an action point, if that's okay.
And in relation to part 4,
part
the
4.
meanwhile use strategy, we have inserted the word safely.
Yes.
Specifically to respond to that and to recognize that there are certain sites that might not allow easy access for safety reasons. So that's supposed to encompass that.
But safety is one element. Feasibility could encompass other things, could it not? Not just safety.
It could. So we still would want to see a strategy come forward to explain how the thought process of designing and phasing the site has also identified any opportunities for the meanwhile use of the site. And here I think it's good to keep in mind in the implementation text also mentions an approach where you would allow something like a temporary garden or more of a not a use per se, but rather access and public realm environment intervention, which is something that the London Planning Authority supports. So there is flexibility in what this overall umbrella encompasses in that sense.
So that's the activated phrase rather than to allow a kind of broad range. Okay, understood. Right, Aberdeen.
I mean, it's a very simple one. Obviously, safety is an absolute priority. This happens. I think feasibility is an important word, important test. Sometimes things that does not bother them. I think the general understanding what feasibility means, I think, would actually help any reader of the plan to understand what's required.
Okay, right, leave that with me. I've got the points there. Thank you. Anything else on those 3 action points then about co-design, master planning, and indeed the indicative site diagrams?
I suppose the only point there is how there's quite a lengthy number of pages on the implementation. Are your instructions to Newham to go away and have a tidy up on the implementation text?
Let me have a
make sure we've got consistency.
I'll leave it with me. I've got the 3 points basically about the and what the outstanding issues are, I think, in relation to them, how they feed through to the implementation text, the SPD that's being adopted. Right. So if there's nothing else on those, we'll move on to the next action points, which were about the CE policy, zero carbon, embodied carbon. So these basically arose from the discussion we had with the consultants about viability, etc. And there was some specific sort of changes proposed in terms of some of the standards. So the first one was, I'll just go through the 3, I think, and then we'll open it up. So the first one was about policy CE2 part 3B1 about the energy intensity use standards, specifically to do with student accommodation. So when we discussed it last time, there was an acknowledgement, I think, that the evidence indicated that something in the range of 50 to 74 maybe where, so rather than the 35 that was in the submitted plan that would have applied to student accommodation. Yeah. So what you've now proposed is 55, so it's in the range that was referred to. Right. Any particular reason that that number was?
Basically about what basically best practice, what the kind of schemes come forward, and it also aligns with the GLA's energy strategy guidance 2022, which is considered residential buildings. The UK net zero kind of carbon building standard just basically also has a range of 74 to 50. So we're trying to encourage kind of best practice, given that the kind of evidence shows that that is kind of viable and achievable. There's a lot more evidence for student accommodation than there was when we initially did this.
So there's a move from 35 to 55. Yeah. Right, I'll just go through the 3 and then we'll come back. rather than pick them off all. So, and then the next one was AP 46, which was about the standards in CE2 Part 4, the amount of energy generated in a year. So these would remain the same, other than for tall buildings, essentially. Yeah. So buildings over 21 metres reduce the amount of energy.
We had a discussion with our consultant about what the best way to appropriately address this issue. And basically, emerging evidence that hasn't quite been published yet is that this is set out in the appendix 1 to ED8A. Basically, PV layouts on commercial building roofs, including student accommodation, what is physically possible between 35 and 70 kilowatt hours per meter squared. So we didn't want to be too aggressive because roofs differ, but we also didn't want to be too challenging. So that's why we went for 50 kilowatt hours per meter squared, and we just used the standard tall building definition of the plan, rather than having specific kind of student accommodation or over a certain height limit. So
it brings that requirement down from 80 to 50, and that's in the range that you say the emerging evidence indicates of 35 to 70. Sort of in the middle of that range.
Yes.
Okay. Right, we'll come back on that one. And then the final one was about the heat network powered by gas. This was about the decarbonisation strategy and the wording, so the different views about that from the NLDC, from the council, and from other parties that are here. So the modification reflects what I suggested in the action point, which was basically to sort of say, well, it's an issue, and there can be a strategy, and that can be negotiated and agreed through the council in a way that many sort of planning matters are. So that's what's been proposed. So we'll see if people have got any comments on that. Anything else you want to say on those 3 action points? No. Yeah, thank you. Right, Unite. Any comments from you?
No, very happy with.
You're content with those? Okay, that reflects the evidence and discussions we had previously. Do you have any comments on? Thank you. Sorry, there was one more, wasn't there?
Okay,
the embodied carbon one, again, this was one where there was a range talked about at the last hearing session. Proposed modification falls broadly within the middle of that range, reduced down from 500 to 7, reduced up to 700.
Yeah, we had a discussion whether to keep the 500 but loosen the wording, or whether to keep the wording loose and loosen the figure.
Well, I was because I was how they work together. So the wording stays the same, but the figures can be changed. Any comments on that?
Okay, support that.
Okay, thank you. All right, which brings me on to the action points relating to social infrastructure. Again, these were sort of quite fine details. The first one was the reference to reconfigured, which you agreed during the last hearing session didn't need to be there, and it's been deleted. So that was a particular issue by AEIM. And then there was the point about the preference if a social infrastructure is to be lost, I suppose what the preferred alternative would be. And that just clarifies that it would be a form of development that would deliver the maximum to affordable housing. To clarify that. So any comments from anyone on those? No, on that one, sorry. The next one was about the relationship between SI 1, 2, 3 and 4, about which parts of which policies apply to which types of social infrastructure. It's all there in the plan. I think this just rolled it together, I think. It doesn't change anything, I don't think, from what you intended, does it?
It doesn't. It's just a lot clearer. So it was actually a helpful point to raise during the examination. So I think it's a lot clearer now in terms of how that policy applies, which policies applies and don't. So we've taken that through all of the SI policies and just made those amends to ensure clarity.
Okay. Well, I think it should be clear. You say that when you keep looking at these things, it's when you first pick it up and you read it that you may see, but I think that should help to provide that
I
clarity.
think it was a helpful amend because you write the policies, they go out for consultation and then actually picking up in the examination was helpful to make that clarity.
Yes.
It has improved.
Okay, but it didn't change any in substance, it just made it clearer about which ones apply to which forms of and the different types of community uses are all clearly defined in the plan with reference to the use classes,
Yes.
whether the main town centre uses or not, etc. So I think you've explored that to be sufficiently brief. The more substantive one was this issue that, again, we've talked about at times, was about when developers are providing new social infrastructure floor space in response to a policy requirement to do so. The council position was, well, it's not just providing some floor space, it's about thinking about the design and nature and layout of that floor space, about what the evidence indicates the user may be, what it needs to be for. So the references to unmet demand and speculative development would go. And again, it repackaged as setting out more clearly what would be expected and why. So that's both through the SI2 Part 1 policy and then quite a lot of new implementation text dealing with different specific types of facilities and who basically you need to liaise with and sort of key issues on those. Okay, so anything you want to say on that? No, I think I understand what's been proposed and why, so I don't have any further questions. Anyone else on that? No, okay. SI4 parts 3B and C, this was an issue that William raised, I know. It was about what was meant by this provision of these education facilities and about what the developer was expected to do and any ongoing commitment. And I think it was clear that it wasn't an ongoing obligation on the developer other than to provide a layout and a design that would then allow such a facility to be extended and whatever in the future. And that those modifications are intended to clarify that intent process by which it would be delivered. Yeah. And you supportive of the change or clearer or happier anyway? Sufficiently happy not to want to push it any further. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Right. New social infrastructure. Which brings me on to the green space policies, well, not really the policies, but the policies map. So, taking a step back, when we had the discussion about green space, the council had listed some sites that a change to the green space designation was being proposed. We went through those as necessary. There were some outstanding issues from some objectives which you explained it wasn't a change needed, so we dealt with all that. Anyway, you've now prepared or are preparing the changes to the policies map for all of them. The exception being the one where we've discussed it at least twice, where the council had proposed a change to the policies map to exclude part of, well, I say part of the park, part of the listed park and garden at West Ham would have been excluded from the green space designation because it wasn't, because the original rationale for its inclusion was something to do with community growing space that was no longer there.
Yes.
So then we had a discussion about, well, is that the only justification for why it might be included in the green space, which led into the statutory listing and the historic boundary to the park, etc. So on that basis, I suggested, I think you agreed, that actually the park in its entirety, reflecting the statutory listing, should all be designated as green space. So that is what, as it was in the submitted plan.
Yes, in the Reg 19.
Yeah, in the Reg 19 plan, that's right. Yeah, okay, so that's where we're at. Obviously, I've read again the corporation, City of London Corporation's objection, as this was referenced both times we discussed it previously, in their aspirations for that. So I suppose two things about that. One, well, the policy, both for green space and other policies in the plan, provides a starting point, a framework. Such a proposal could be brought forward, and there would be a process to go through and policy tests to be applied.
Correct.
So that isn't an absolute no to that. That's something that would then. So that's that. They're not here to argue the case. It could have been. So I don't know what the implications of that is. But anyway, I understand their point. But that's that. The only other thing I suppose about it then is, so from my point of view, the plan included all of the park as green space. So my question is, well, do I need to modify it to exclude some of it? I think my view, as I indicated before, I don't think so, because of the statutory listing and that providing a framework to start any sort of process for, proposals to redevelop parts of it. So I think that's where I am on that. I suppose it does bring me back to the definition of green space then, whether it's just spot on. It starts by saying all vegetated open space of public value. And obviously green, and this is a reason not just here, but it arose at the XF, didn't it? What's the green space? Does it include this path going across the green space? So I suppose it's just whether that definition needs tweaking to reflect that any bit of green space, whether it's a woodland, a nature conservation site, a park, will be landscaped in different ways, and the landscaping can change over time, over years, decades, whatever, can't it? I mean, this historically, I understand, was an area of this that was a nursery garden.
Right.
Then it evolved into horticulture and hard standings and buildings, etc., and whatever else. So I suppose that's the only question that it's green space implies, yes, it's predominantly vegetated, but it doesn't mean every square metre of it is vegetated at any particular point in time, does it?
No, we can look at that definition to provide that clarity.
They might just help, mightn't it? Otherwise you get an argument and say, well, this bit is discrete from the rest of it, it's not vegetated, whatever.
Noted.
Right, okay, thank you. Anything else on green space from anyone? No. Right, brings us on to the next one. The fact that a good hotel and their legal representative aren't here suggests possibly that they're content with the modifications that are proposed. So just to be clear, this, I think, this brings the plan, I think, into line with what the London plan is trying to say about water-dependent uses. That's my reading of this and the discussion we previously had, and it addresses the specific issue of permanent moored vessels, which the London plan does as well. I think it seems to provide clarity about that. I mean, when you use the example of that good hotel, you can think about what it means for that, but that's not what this policy is really for. It's about all the water spaces, which brought us on to the end policies, specifically about the docklands and the docks, and you've dealt with that there as well, to acknowledge that those particular water spaces are of a particular character, and that this sort of water-dependent use would be supported, subject to whatever. So that's the position there. So that provides a clear framework for that. I suppose the question is, do you get much pressure? Do you anticipate as the development around these docks increases? Both on the Silvertown side and along here at some point, presumably, do you get more interest in that sort of water-dependent use?
We do, and we can see the huge benefit of the development of the docks, but it's making sure that it's appropriate and suitably scaled, and that it brings that benefit to people to actively use the water, because there is a desire for people from around the area to use the water more, and it's a huge benefit for health and well-being and public realm improvements. And that was always the intention of the policy, and the intention was to align it with SI 17. So if that helps to bring it further in line and improve that clarity, then we're happy to make those amends as we have done.
Yeah, okay. So the point being, the distinction between that is using the docks as an opportunity to use the water that brings, but not just treat it as an extension to the land for development that just wants to grab a bit more space.
Yes, exactly.
Which is that thing, that balance that needs to be struck. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Well, I don't think anyone here has probably got any comments they wish to make about that. So, okay. Right, thank you. Which brings us on to waste management. We discussed this week before sessions and the relationship between the three policies in the plan and the plan that is now at examination, I understand, for the East London Joint Waste Plan. Yep. So we had a discussion about the relationship, and we which parts of W1, 2 and 3 were duplicating what will be in the East London plan and what's shown on the policy map. So I think what you've proposed is, you looked at W1 and you thought, well, that isn't necessarily, it duplicates and there's a risk of inconsistency, so just leave that for the joint plan. And then we talked about parts W2 and W3, where you were saying there's parts of those that are Newham specific, and you looked at it and you said, well, some parts are, some parts aren't. That's what's the rationale for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so similar to W1, yeah, there were some bits of duplication about new waste sites that were sort of better addressed through the joint waste plan update.
Okay, fine. And the policy map will be updated to show the safeguarded waste sites when the plan East London joint plan is adopted. So when you adopt this plan, you will have your adopted Newham local plan policies map.
Yeah.
You'll change it based on the changes that are shown on this plan's map.
Yes.
So there won't be any changes to the waste sites. So they'll get carried forward as they are in the existing adopted plan in Newham on the policies map.
I think probably what we would do is keep the. I think what probably would be the most sensible approach would just rely on the London plan and not have waste sites on our policies map, but effectively use the London plan definition to determine what sort of waste site between this point before we get the new waste plan adopted. Was my thought if we're taking the.
Can you take them off?
The map.
Can you take them off the adopted policies map? How does that? It's
Yeah,
not. I don't know. See, I can't recommend changes to policies map.
No, that's all right.
You when you adopt a new DPD under the 2004 Act, you have to say how you're going to change the previously adopted policies map. So you're saying that through what you're saying to me will be on the policies map, and it's silent on waste. So I'll leave it with you. It's not really nice. I mean, I think you probably want to be pragmatic. I mean, when the waste plan, the joint waste plan is adopted, that will designate sites, won't it, to safeguard them.
Yeah.
It's just that interim about what it's helpful or not helpful to show. Maybe the easiest thing is to take them off and say they'll be shown when the waste plan's adopted.
I think that's probably easier, yeah, because there will be some changes to the adopted few sites that we've got in the current 2012 plan. So I think it would probably be more confusing to a developer being like, oh, it's, that our site's not up to date, when actually it is through the London plan.
Okay, I'll leave it with you. Anyway, okay, thank you. I don't expect anyone's got any comments on that one. No, okay. Bringing me on to the airport policy. Again, we spoke about this last time. It was quite a specific point in the plan about mitigation and what can't be mitigated. We discussed that in the context of national policy, London plan policy, this policy, and then the implementation text. So you've modified that. So you've proposed modification to that. I think that's clear. It flags up those particular issues, but it provides a framework for assessing any proposals in relation to those through, the way that the London plan and indeed this policy would expect them to be assessed, i.e. through, evidence of thoroughly looking at the impacts would be. Okay, so anything further you want to say about that? No, okay, thank you. Right, so we whizzed through that list, that's fine. We will move on to site allocations. We'll just have a break for just 20 past 11, so 11 minutes. We'll put that. That's okay. Thank you. Right, so we'll move on to the next items on the agenda under the heading site allocations and the action points relating to these. First one was just a very minor, a one-word change to the N7SA1 related to Abbey Mills, and specifically referring to the temporary mosque. So that's been done. I suppose anyone's got any comments on that? No. Right, which brings us on to the Rick Roberts Way, and the outstanding action point here was about the clarification of the reference to 1.2 hectares of green space and also for play areas. Council's clarified that the 1.2 hectares is the green space and you park, and that the play areas be additional to that. Presumably they could be part of the park, but it would be this is the quantification based on the standard formula.
The capacity, yeah.
Any comments on that?
Yes. I guess maybe I misunderstood, but I thought we were under the understanding that it would make sense for it to form the Newham play space to form part of the quantum given the targets from the LCS permission, which essentially is inclusive of those spaces. Reading the rationale in terms of what was modelled in the site capacity study, the reference being ED003B, it's mentioned that it modelled 1.37 hectares of open space, but this model is accounting the entire site allocation and not just the publicly owned land. And then on page 83 of the site capacity study, it does specify that on LDC owned land and Newham owned land, there should be 1.2 hectares of open space. So I guess that's where we're not fully understanding the rationale behind the 1.2 hectares being separate to Muga and play space, given that the model accounted for the site allocation as a whole. But then the site allocation itself expects 1.2 hectares and the Muga and play space on publicly owned land. So we do maintain our position that the 1.2 hectare should include the Muga and the play space as per the LCS permission.
Yeah, we can. I think for clarity that we're not disagreeing with that, it can come forward on the same amount of site. I think we was trying to explain that we looked at the kind of the needs of Muga, play and green space separately, identifying what the suitable sites would be. So the asks, it's read as separate, but how it comes forward, we didn't depict that within the policy. We've obviously, this is a nuanced site because there's publicly owned land and that we've kind of set that out within the policy. Yeah. But in terms of how it comes forward, that will be, something that will be negotiated at the application stage, but also I'm aware that you've got the LCS application, so that's already kind of counted for. But I think for clarity, we're not opposing that can't come forward within the same space.
I guess it's not necessarily that it can't come forward within the same space. I think it's just that it says minimum 1.2 hectares as a separation, and then on top of that, we're going to play space. I think where we're coming from is that is part of the 1.2 hectare quantum.
Yeah, that's
that.
Yeah,
okay,
that's fine.
So at the moment, the modification would say provide a small green space with a minimum 1.2 hectares and provide a sports lit and on publicly owned land. And it also then goes on, in addition, talks about play space, locally equipped, local area of play. So it does kind of, when it talks and in addition, it's suggesting these are.
It's identifying that these sites do need to explore and provide those. So how they come forward though,
Okay. So you're saying that the quantification, the minimum is 1.2.
Mm-hmm.
But you seem to say that the justification for that 1.2 is based on the quantities needed of certain types of open space, which don't include the play area type things. So that you seem to be suggesting, well, in terms of quantity, that would be extra.
I mean, I think it was, we don't want to obviously plan those sites for them. These are what we've identified as needs. So we've set those out within the allocations. How those come forward will obviously come through the master planning process or planning application stage. We don't really want to set out exactly where they will come forward, but those asks have been identified separately because some sites might not need a Muga or play space, but they might need green space. So it's kind of setting out what those requirements would be.
Yeah, I guess where we are coming from is that an officer's interpretation of that might be that you do 1.2 hectares green
as a minimum.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, there's play and there's Muga. So I think that's where we are a bit concerned that that's how it could be interpreted. So I do wonder if it would be a bit more clear if it were to say this should include Muga and play space, because that's where,
Yeah.
especially if it's specified on publicly owned land, is where we are coming from. Because the site capacity study that is referred to as the rationale to include it on top of it, the 1.37 hectare, that is across the entire site allocation. So that's why because there would be green space on St William's site as well, for example. So that's why I'm trying to understand the separation of that.
No, of course, yeah. So I think ultimately what we looked at was what were the needs, and we modelled those within the site allocation capacity where obviously the site is a bit nuanced with the publicly owned land, private ownership, and we're trying to separate that. Obviously certain needs might come under certain different parcels of the site. However, when we looked at the site strategically, we identified the sites that needed the open space in line with the London Plan hierarchy, and also within our evidence base there was obviously deficits within play space and other requirements. So we looked at what sites could deliver those. So the asks are separate in kind of, when we looked at it, we looked at all green space, play space, and those needs separately. But with this site, obviously, with it having publicly accessible open land and that kind of being agreed within the LCS permission, we wanted to identify that those requirements would come forward on the publicly open space, publicly owned space, sorry. But appreciate that of it, how it's written for this site, it does read that there, I mean, I can see how both ways. There's two separate asks that how they come forward, they could come forward together. But in some other sites, they come forward separately. It might be that's how they master plan that site. But how we looked at it and how we've set it out, that we did look at those asks separately, but how they come forward obviously can come forward in a different way. And that's how we tried to set it out also in the 4.3 paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes, so the choice is there's enough flexibility applications to 4.3, etc.
Yeah.
By this being or further clarification needed. I'm just actually, the reference to publicly owned land isn't in the submitted. That's part of the modification.
Yeah.
I mean, that presumably reflects what's on the indicative diagram, where the green blobs are. Land ownership isn't usually a reference point in allocation policies, is it? But
if I recall, did that not come from a Regulation 18 request for it to be
the
19?
19?
Yeah, I think that was a request to add that in.
Not so myself.
It was okay. So if we took out, just trying to think.
I think leave it with me rather. I mean, the one way of doing this would be to sort of restructure it slightly and sort of say that the development should provide a minimum of 1.2 hectares, minimum of 1.2 hectares. Mm-hmm. This should include whatever you've done. Is that a small park, a small green space, and itemise the other things?
Yeah.
And I almost leave it at that. And it's a minimum.
Just for this site?
Well,
it's the nuances.
I do share the LLDC's interpretation. The way I think you may read this is there's 1.2, and then in addition to that, you need space for this and space for that and space for that, because the way it's expressed does come across like that at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's not what we've modelled, but I think what we're trying to say is that we do share what you're saying around the LCS permission. We want to make sure this site's deliverable and that you can bring that forward. But how we have modelled it is that there are these needs. There is that 1.2 hectares. That is there is a play space requirement. We've done that for all of our sites, but there's flexibility within the policies that this needs to come forward on the green space. That can come forward in that way. But I do read the concern, and I think that's why we tried to move it and include it in the same part of the policy, so it's kind of read more together than so separately as how it was read previously.
I do wonder if there, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but is there benefit in removing that target? But you know that most site applications don't have a target within the site allocation itself, and I feel like the target is applicable because of the LCS permission.
We do depict the hectareage most on different site allocations, yeah.
Because for the very reason that if we don't, we're not going to maintain the 0.72 hectares per 1,000 people, and actually the NPPF is guiding us towards that direction anyway. So we're doing what the NPPF is asking us to do, because if we don't, we won't specify it. I think the point is the capacity study does show that there's 1.37 hectares, but we appreciate that the LCS, that may not be possible. So there is that flexibility within paragraph 4.3 of the section 4. But the approach is that if this were to come all in again, there is capacity on that site to do the 1.2 hectare park, the Muga and the play space that comes in the 1.37 hectares in the capacity modelling, albeit because this site and its nature, we may have to look to deliver it another way. There is that flexibility in the plan.
Okay,
There's that.
understood. I think we'll just leave it with me and I'll have a think about whether any further changes needed or not. So unless there's anything else.
No, nothing else. I think, yeah, I guess it's just more of an interpretation point, because I do understand the modelling, but I think it's still, the modelling does apply across the entire site allocation. So it's just, I think that's an important distinction still in terms of the 1.37 hectare that's referred to, because that's not just in,
Okay. Yeah.
There.
Okay, thank you. Right, which brings us on to the next two items, which we may have a bit more to discuss about. First one is Beckton Riverside again. Just actually, just before I do that, we'll just kind of just look at the action points related to, basically it's the wording of the key on the policies map for where you've got proposed new centres or extensions to centres. I think what the key has been amended to include the word indicative now to reflect that line, which is a specific line on the policies map, isn't fixed in stone. It can be set in indicative. And the example of the way the wording in Beckton Riverside is expressed, we'll look at that in a minute, but it talks about that, focusing on that area or whatever. So, okay, so that would apply to each of the key designations where it isn't an existing town centre. So whether it's an extension to a town centre, an extension to a local centre, or a new town centre, or a new local centre, or whatever, it would always be labelled as indicative. Yeah, to provide that flexibility. Fine. And then you provided two maps, which is the updates to the site maps or the indicative diagrams for Silvertown Quays and the Sugar House Island. And that reflected the discussion we had about the changes to the policies map, whether it be town centre extensions. Yeah. So that's how they would be through. Okay, so we've got those. Which brings us on to Beckton Riverside. So the action points really related to the way the different parts of M17SA1 implementation text of HS1 referred to what was shown on the policies map. There were sort of different phrases used. So we've got two things now. One, the policy map itself will talk about them being indicative. Obviously, the diagram itself is labelled as indicative. And then we've got the phrase now, which is basically saying starting from the indicative boundaries, any changes to that boundary being justified, blah, blah, blah. So it's providing as much clarity and precision as is possible at this point in time, with some flexibility to accept that it is an indicative boundary and it could change in detail. So that seems to strike the appropriate balance between clarity and flexibility. So I think you're nodding on that side of the table. Yeah. Okay. So, well and good. Then we get the TfL comments on the statement of common ground, which we hadn't had previously. So I've just looked at that again now. So this in essence comes down to the modification, actually to the bit of the policy, which is about odour, the odour barrier, rather than the design and layout and the transition to the town centre. But I understand what they're raising. So let's just explore what the concern is and whether it's well-founded or not. So basically, they don't like the reference to retention of the existing retail warehouses is also considered as an appropriate buffer. So as I say, reference to the existing warehouse being retained was solely in the context of providing a buffer. It isn't referred to anywhere else in the policy. So I suppose the question that arises, well, in terms of the retention, the policy is aiming to create a new town centre with all that goes with it in terms of public realm, placemaking, this, that and the other. But we also know that the amount of floor space is we're going to get this right. It's a district, it's a district centre, and it could transform in the longer term to a major centre. And that reflects the amount of floor space and the catchment for the existing retail park, etc. Okay, so that's the context, and this carefully negotiated modification was all about allowing that transition in a way that is going to be viable and feasible, etc., all understood. But the long-term aspiration will still be this new town centre. So, and that's all so far so good until we get this reference to the existing retail warehouse potentially being retained as a buffer, and the inclusion of the two of the buildings being in the town centre. So when we talked about that before, that was to allow those buildings to be kept and to allow the town centre to develop and grow around them, the amount of car parking to be reduced as time goes by, etc., etc. I suppose then the questions are the long-term life of those buildings. I think the need is certainly in the transition and possibly in the medium term to keep them. Does that mean that's the long-term objective or not necessarily? Or is that just unknown? I'm looking at this side of the table to start with.
So, if I may answer this.
Yeah, please.
I think we've had a quite useful, pragmatic discussion about this. It may be a case, the first point really is that TfL may have not had a benefit of those discussions.
Yeah.
It's sort of coming slightly from outside. That's probably the heart of what we're talking about. The second point is we dealt with matters through the discussion about the town centre boundary, which is also agreed, and that's starting point in that transition. It's very clear about it. The third point, which probably is most important, which maybe TfL didn't have the benefit of in those discussions, was the idea of we all trying to work out how the town centre will emerge. Will be some movement, probably, of retailers. There is not certainty about that, certainly, as Brian Kelly discussed on the previous sessions. So actually having the retail warehouses recognised as serving a role at the moment, even if it isn't long term, I think is actually important, because it's recognising firstly how this may be delivered in terms of, rather than just creating a new town centre which comes from nowhere, it's actually part of this iterative process, which is also part of making sure it will work commercially and deliverable in terms of the retailer's aspirations as well as Aberdeen. So actually recognising the role potentially positively which they retail warehouses play, I think is important. And I think I've spoken to Aberdeen and they do think it is important to recognise that, because it's actually talks to the success, future success of the town centre, and future delivery of that town centre, even if we don't end up with it. But I think we're in danger of crystal ball gazing on a later phase and probably hanging too much weight on. So, in terms of looking at it another way, then, if you read what the TfL concerns are, but the implication may be that it would end up with a typology, as they call it, of retail floor space and associated car parking that would continue to be car dependent. That seems to be their worst case scenario. But there's all the policy wording of HS1, part 2, and the allocation policy is all about managing that transition to a new town centre and reducing the car parking, etc., and the DRR being there. So you would say, I suppose, well, that is misplaced that concern because that's what the policy is aiming to achieve in the long term. Yeah? Okay. And in terms of the reference to the buildings being an odour barrier, I think we talked about you saying that there's no evidence that odour is a problem for shoppers, and therefore implicitly, well, those buildings must be performing some function in that respect, or whatever. Yeah.
So the fact that there isn't an odour problem now would mean that we shouldn't be an odour problem in the future, because if the buildings are there, nothing's going to change.
But just in terms of it, we had a discussion about how that future public realm would actually operate. It's actually not a shopping environment, it ends up being a residential environment, it might be different. So,
yeah.
I think the main point really though remains that this is a transition point. And at the moment, there will be retail warehouses at the moment, and I do think, and our plan's vision is clear, that you'll find us to very much second guess what could be there from very later days. I think it might be that TfL are looking at this from a more development control perspective of just trying to restrict car parking rather than actually really talking about functional retail warehouses at all.
Yeah.
Maybe that may be a little bit of a red herring to control their main objective.
And as I said, I mean, there are various policy references about
And there's
management.
plenty of control to actually deal with that transition elsewhere in the plan, as we discussed in our session. So I think that's the reason why we very much agree with the proposal.
Right. Okay, Council, anything you want to add?
Everyone. There are two elements to this.
Yes.
One is obviously the design function of a building functioning as a buffer,
Yeah.
which ties in consistently across the plan with various other applications, site allocations, to policy T6.
Yeah.
And requirement as part of agent of change that there is buffering of sill. In this case, the odor comes into play as well, site. Now, our implementation typically says that this buffer should be a non-residential employment-led buffer. In the case of this specific site, non-residential can also still mean suitably the retention of the retail warehouses, because from a physical perspective, they would look fairly similar to a stacked industrial unit that we would be able to support there as part of policies in the plan. But it's context specific to this site.
Yeah.
So that's why we feel that there's two elements of it. One is this buffer. The council's approach to all buffers is that they should be non-residential. Therefore, this area is by its nature excluded from the overall, or in principle, it's not necessarily, there could be evidence to come forward to say that there could be residential implemented here and somehow safeguarded.
Yeah.
But for now, we don't have that, and our approach is non-residential here. That means that the overall site capacity of the site, which feels to be the main issue that TfL are dealing with, is already, as part of even the wording of the policy before this amendment, excluding this area. So there's not been a change in the approach for the site. The overall capacity of the site still remains on the rest of the site south of this buffer zone. That's one element. Secondly, the retail and leisure study is very clear that in order for the town centre to succeed, we need to retain that capacity of the comparison floor space. Let me just relog, I can give you the exact reference.
Yeah.
Recommendation sections. And in that sense, as you've heard, and the market being as it is, it's a better approach, we feel, to be reasonably supportive of retaining, at least in part, what is there, with potential that some of it could be at a later phase consolidated into the future town centre, but allowing for that side-by-side scenario to evolve over time. In order to safeguard that very important retail floor space that we need in order for the town centre to be successful. So the reference is just at the end, page 142 of the retail and leisure study. It's paragraph 14.55, and it's kind of like in the middle of
Okay. Okay. So, yes, understood. I mean, as we talked about before, we need this transition, and the transition will be some of the buildings existing. In terms of placemaking in the long term, it could be that eventually they would then get replaced. But if they were in place, well, they probably will get replaced at some point in the long term. But again, you'd still have the issue of assuming the treatment works is still there, and a need for mitigation. And so you'd need a substantial building form of some mitigation there of non-residential uses. But it could be a different form of retail use.
Or even non-retail, it could be transformed over the long time, that it does become something more employment or any other kind of use. It's the idea of the buffer is more in principle for it to be non-residential, for it to
going back,
physically.
Sorry. Yeah. So going back to what I said, I mean, the introduction of this reference to retaining the warehouse buildings is only in the it's after you've gone through this understanding of what the policy is trying to achieve, and it's only in the context of acting as a buffer. Okay. Rather than it being a long-term policy outcome that
no, it can be retained. It doesn't mean it has to be retained.
Okay, Aberdeen.
I think Antonio described it far better than I did. So the allowing the side-by-side scenario is the heart of what we're talking about, and it could easily be the case that those retail warehouses are replaced by important uses. So I think that's the reason why I think this wording works very well.
And in terms of it being a fairly definitive statement, it's also considered as an appropriate buffer.
Yeah.
You're saying, well, two elements to that. One, the evidence indicates from users of the shopping park it seems to provide a buffer. Secondly, you're saying in design and scale terms, it's consistent with the evidence base for stacked industrial buildings providing a buffer sort of. Okay, right, understood.
So I think there is the third element, which Jenny also mentioned, which is the delivery of the town centre, and having the side by side to make sure it aligns with the retail study.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Okay, right. I don't think I've got anything else on that. Anything else anybody wishes to say about this allocation? No? Okay. Right, thank you. Which brings us on to the East Ham Gasworks. So we discussed this previously twice. First of all, in general terms, in terms of the policy and the viability, etc., etc. But then there was a modification proposed to release some land from Mall as a way of making the site viable by allowing a sufficient quantum of development without going upwards further than the plan would allow, but allowing more development space, obviously by releasing this many points, whatever it is, 1.6 hectares, isn't it? Of land from the Metropolitan Open land. 1.84, I think. Okay, so we discussed all that, and the GLA were here, and they were saying, in principle, they didn't think exceptional circumstances had been demonstrated to justify the release of the Metropolitan Open land, and the various reasons for that. One of which they seem to have an in principle objection to releasing Mall to meet housing targets. So anyway, we talked about that. One of the points was that that's not actually what the London Plan says, is it? It is a policy that allows exceptional circumstances to be demonstrated subject to what the criteria are. So anyway, that's where we got to on that. The GLA are coming this afternoon, but I did actually ask the programme officer to check with them what their position was on this. And my understanding is they still have some concern, but the concern is reduced by this modification. I think they will say it's not a general conformity issue, it's a matter of judgment about whether the Mall release is justified by exceptional circumstances with these modifications which are aimed at ensuring the provision of improved public open space and the various components of it. So that's my understanding of the position. Obviously, I need to make a judgment about the modification. As I said previously, I think from what Sir William said, as submitted, the policy and all the policies in the plan doesn't facilitate a form of development that would meet all the abnormal costs and the constraints of the site and deliver a viable form of development at the scale that the plan would allow. So with the modification, the amount of development space and the various policy requirements relating to open space enhancement and provision, that's where we've got to. So anything you want to say about that?
No, yeah, I think obviously we've outlined kind of strengthening our policy position on kind of what we would expect to see moving forward on the site in line with the exceptional circumstances case. And yes, we obviously did meet with the GLA to have that, try and alleviate some issues, but yeah, what we heard from what we just set out, that was their latest position, which was
okay,
yeah.
And that correlates with what your understanding of the GLA position is.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think there was some comments I think from Quad that we got around the map. I think I just want to clarify that in terms of the map that we've provided, this was to kind of show to you like the action point of the deallocation of Mole, which there is one little error in the parcel to the south. But in terms of what we actually envision of putting forward as the indicative map, for the site allocation, we would want the the kind of opportunity for green space to remain largely the same as what we've got within the policy map, because that is designated green space. And yeah, we've set that out to the developer, but I think it was just to clarify that that's kind of what we would see in the plan.
So that green space designation would stay as pretty much where the mall is then.
So yeah,
other than the little bits.
Yeah.
So to the south of the gas hole, the structure.
Yeah.
That would be released from mall, but it would still be shown as green space on this indicative map.
Yeah.
So what would be on that? What would be the capacity of the site in terms of residential units on your?
So largely it would be the opportunity, that the green space would be kind of ensuring that from the pre-apps that we've been seeing is maximising the green space within that residential area as well, which is kind of aligning with what's coming forward. But I think it was just to clarify that kind of the mapping shows the deallocation of Mole, but there is obviously still the green space south.
But that would indicate, I suppose, that would be back to where they were originally, in terms of the developable area.
Yeah, no,
yeah, so Green Water Space 1 does allow development to come forward on green space. It's just maximising that amount. So it doesn't have a higher protection as Mole. So we've seen the pre-application drawings coming forward. It's just saying that the green spaces around the residential that will come from that site should be where the designated green space is currently. So there's still a green space designation on that site, albeit we've reduced the Mole designation significantly.
Based on that indicative map then, if that were to be the case, what's the council's estimate of the capacity? I mean, would it change from what it was originally, the 250 or whatever?
Yeah, yeah.
It would?
Yes.
Based on what?
That you can build on the green space.
Okay, right, understood. Okay, I'll come to something in a minute. So in terms of the various things that are being sought and would be provided on the green space, what was it? Must enhance green space with a strong emphasis on, well, first of all, to protect the openness of the retained metro.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and continue a chain of green space along the eastern boundary. So that's fine. And then within the development area and the green space, strong emphasis on increasing openness. But what does that mean? Isn't it open now? You're going to put buildings on it, so it's not going to increase the openness, is it?
We could prefer that for maintaining, I think that was, maintaining openness.
That again suggests we can't build on any of the green bit.
Of the Mole, I guess it's the Mole, so I think that.
Well, that's all down within the paragraph above the sentence above, isn't it?
Take that out.
I think that, I think that is a good. And then he brings on to the various different roles and functions and purposes of the open space, which is about public access, connectivity, legibility, biodiversity, etc. sports pitches, so various different things that have been provided on this open space.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, understood. Yeah, and then you identify what the deficiencies are in the area that you're serving, so that's understood. And that is specific reference to a park, minimum 2 hectares. But again, that's consistent with the evidence and the that's fine. Okay, understood. Right. Unless there's anything else you want to say, I'll hand over to William.
Thank you, Phil. I want to tell you that we also had a discussion with the GLA regarding their position on release. And while I don't want to put word into their mouth, they are much more comfortable with the proposed modification. I think what they were looking for more clarity around the benefits, particularly what happened with the remaining part in terms of vision, to basically meet with the requirements of the plan policy, for public access, biodiversity and ecology enhancement. And I think that the revised wording goes a long way now to addressing those concerns. And so that I did ask the officer whether they were attending this morning, and they said that they were. I'm assuming that they would not just respond through the consultation on modifications. I think in terms of the green space point, I mean, we are progressing our pre-app discussions with council, and I think as the officers have alluded to, the green space element within the build development, we're trying to bring in the open space into the development, and I suppose bring that character, that landscape character, in and around the buildings, and I think that's clearly what the officers have been saying through the pre-app process. That's in their mind how they envision green space policy working. So I think we're quite comfortable with that.
Well, leaving aside any pre-app discussions, etc.
Yes.
No, I mean, but just looking at it from another point of view, if you read the words of the policy and you look at the indicative map,
Yes.
which obviously is what I'm concerned with, I suppose are you satisfied that that will facilitate a sufficient quantity of development, and that would allow a sufficient quantity of development and to address all the difficult constraints and abnormal costs, etc.
Yeah,
make this viable.
Yes, I think the area of the mall release, and there will be buildings on there, there will be but we are, we're looking at 600 to 700 homes in terms of density. And so, yes, that quantum does help us overcome certainly stressful around biology.
So the 600 to 700 homes based on the pre-app schemes
Yes.
you're working on, so that would be in the white area, so within the area that's currently occupied by the gas holder structure. And the area to the...
And then mould is going to be de-designated.
Yes, and the area to the west of that that's shown white on this indicative plan.
Yes.
And then some of the green space that's removed from the mould to the south of the structure.
Yeah.
But that working within the green space designation as for the the design and layout sort of it. Yeah. So your estimate of 600 to 700 homes in entirety as opposed to what was assumed 200, whatever it was originally in the councils. Okay. And you've not, broad terms, that's the sort of scale that you think would be.
Yeah.
You want to ensure that it's viable. Okay, understood.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, please.
Just to Simon's comments.
Yeah.
I guess the point of differentiation that we're talking about now is on the green allocation relates to our previous comments that I think we thought that the green allocation was going to be over the MOL, not on the original area of hold standing. But we've discussed that point, if you're happy with that.
Well, I think if it's not
adding a new green allocation.
I think, we understood that it would be on the area that was going to be de-designated from the MOL. We accept that. I think I'm not sure that it's necessary to extend it to the area where the existing hard standing is. However, our design does bringing green into those spaces. So it's not the end of the world, but is it necessary? I suppose would be a question about is it necessary to.
So you're talking about this little square on the on the what's currently hard standing. why that's shown there. Why is that shown there?
This square is designated mole currently. And
Oh, is it?
Still
It's-
meets the test of mole. We've just set the exceptional circumstances, but the areas of mole also align with the designated green space on the site as well, and also sink. But there's flexibility with green. Essentially, it's what does this indicative map show? It was showing where existing green space was as well. So it's not saying that it can't be reconfigured and removed, but it's the best guess other than looking at that diagram again, if that. Yeah.
We could look at that.
Yeah.
We've had really constructive discussions through.
Yeah.
So
I think that's the best.
we're updating the map, aren't we, just to pick up that area to the south that wasn't shown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the allegation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you provided a map in document DD 28 with an indicative map with the mole excluded.
Yeah.
Yeah, take it. So you're saying that's not the modification to the submitted site map. That's still to be, that could remain the same, or that will be modified?
Yeah, we can
again?
overlay the deallocation mole layer if that's necessary.
Well, I think I'll leave that.
Yeah, that's
And
fine.
we can,
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah.
And I was going to say just two other points. One was you picked up the increasing openness, so thank you for that. There was just a point about the back river. So it says explore the restoration of the back river. This is on page 38.
Yeah.
Which is fine, and it was just more broader point is that the back river was a kind of a small bend off the main river that came into the site in the southwest corner. We will never be able to restore that because that's where all the easements are. And remember the original plan that we've got, which is all the relevant area. And you can't connect back into the main river. So on the basis that is definitely not deliverable, question mark as to whether that remains in the policy. But equally, if it does, that's fine because we can kind of go through the exploration with you.
yes. Our preference would be that it's maintained in there, given of the Green Water Space 2 policies, which is about discovering those hidden back rivers, and there was an aspiration as well from some bodies to bring that forward if it's not viable and if it's not possible. That can of course be taken through the planning discussions that we have, but that was an original requirement in the site allocation. It's the first time you've raised that you've got that deleted. Yeah,
Just say explore the rest.
yeah, exactly.
It's not-
It's
a
the
fair-
first time.
No, that's fine. It's just
Yeah.
through the work that's been going on in the background.
Of course.
So that's fine.
It will do something will be in the spirit.
Yeah, and given flooding and where we're going with climate change, I think,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
I guess, sorry, just the bullet point 6 on page 38, protecting, enhancing and bringing back into public use the disused the sports pitches.
Mhm.
I guess the points they were never in public use. Again, we will be bringing back sports provision for the public to use, but again, it's just sometimes with that wording, it can give the public the impression that there were publicly accessible sports facilities on site.
We could take the word back out and then
It still be, it's just effective, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you. Which is great. So that's all fantastic. I think we don't need to get into the updates regarding the viability work that's been undertaken. I know that's coming on this afternoon in terms of the affordable housing.
Yeah.
But I did, if you're allowing me to, just want to make kind of 3 or 4 points regarding this site, because this site does form part of that viability update that perhaps will correlate into some comments that we'll make this afternoon just regarding the necessity for flexibility to be written to the plan, specifically regarding affordable housing, because upon the application and reliance on the whole plan viability assessment, there are always some exceptions, and it could just give you 5 minutes to explain those just specifically regarding this site. So the update work, which was ET 26A, 26 and 27, basically reran some of those percentages at this site included. And these are just kind of specifically high level comments that we'd just like to make. So that assessment assumes a site area, a development site area of 1.65 hectares, Obviously, the site area increases now, but the key point on that is that the viability assessment doesn't consider the whole site, 10.3 hectares, and that's because of the mold to some extent. But the issue with that is that the whole site needs to be remediated and was subject to abnormal costs. So as abnormal costs are excluded, and those abnormal costs can range significantly, but in the town hamlets, local plan review BNPP did apply abnormal costs to gas work sites, in that case, 3.2 million per hectare. We've submitted evidence in our hearing statement 1 regarding the other gas work sites, and they have abnormal costs of 5 to 10 million pounds per hectare. So what we're just saying is those abnormal costs are significant and do materially affect viability as a whole, and most brownfield previously developed sites have those abnormal costs. And therefore, whilst they are removed, and this is always the case, BNPP always remove abnormal costs from whole plant viability, there isn't anywhere else what comes this afternoon that recognises that, and therefore there can be a misunderstanding about levels of housing that are applied. We've talked about the site capacity, that's fine. The whole plan viability assumed 254 homes. We've made representations that you couldn't deliver that without deallocation anyway. We had a figure of 187 to 200 homes, but we're now talking about a much larger figure, which the client team have recognised from their experience could overcome those deliverability issues. We've also picked up the document, the viability list at ED026 assumes a benchmark land value on this site of basically an empty cleared site of 0.5 million per hectare. It's BLV3.
Yeah.
Actually, it should be BLV2, which is the 5.2 million pound, because the area of hard standing that it is assessing is being let for light industrial uses, its car dealership, ownership, nor a dealership. Car works. Can't buy a car there, but you can definitely go and lift up some crash cars. So there are operations, there's leasing, which again, we don't expect any of this to change, but what we are saying is, having gone through even that process, it's showing with the right BLB that there's a marginal, it's about £1 million surplus at 20% of all housing with no employment and training costs. So that just, I think, restores the confidence that I think you came to, sir, that you do need a quantum of housing on there, additional quantum of housing to make the allocation deliverable, but also, as we'll come on to later on, that reliance on the whole plan viability assessment to demonstrate levels of viability must be joined up with caveat written into the policy text to recognise the limitations of that viability assessment.
In terms of the PPG, I know there's been various comments about the applicability of a plan-led viability assessment to London with the complexity of the sites, etc., etc. But that's what national policy expects. The PPG, when it talks about site-specific viability assessments, it talks about referring back to the assumptions that were made in the plan viability assessment.
Yeah.
So whilst the plan may not acknowledge that the viability assessment doesn't factor in abnormal costs, that process is there in national guidance and would be applied presumably by the council in acknowledgement of that. So is that something you think is necessarily a shortcoming in the plan?
It is. I mean, I think what happens regularly, and this is why my team spends time and energy at local plan inquiries, because we're caught between two things. We're caught between the PPG that says the whole plan viability should be deliverable and reflective of ultimate viability.
Yeah.
You then get whole plan viability assessments that do include caveats, and they say the thresholds that they're testing generally aren't viable. You then have a policy that slightly ignores that and puts forward all of the housing thresholds that it thinks is the right thing to do, but it's not backed up by viability. but then the caveats contained in the whole plan viability assessment aren't carried through into the plan. So you then have councillors, members of the public, third parties all expecting that the threshold set out in the plan will be delivered on a site-by-site basis. You then also don't have, certainly regarding affordable housing, you then don't have transparency and support for the viability tested route that the whole plan viability says is the get out, because you have some kind of slightly tight wording about the viability, but it's not reflective of the London plan that gives the viability tested route equal weight. And it then also doesn't give you equal weight to the maximum amount of housing that is delivered through that viability tested route. So as practitioners and client teams, you end up in this elongated whirlwind of the public expecting 60% or 50% or 35%. Whole plan viability evidence demonstrating that that's not reasonable or deliverable on the majority of the sites. And again, we look at a lot of these, as I'm sure you do, and the wording changes a little bit. I mean, whoever's got the time to go through every red and green tab, it never counts those up. It used to say in the majority of scenarios it's viable. That doesn't appear that much. It says that it is deliverable, but you need the viability to allow flexibility. So, and then you've got the PPG basically saying in the new NPPF saying even more, because we've got a draft national development policy which says whole plan viability first, unless you can demonstrate why you don't correlate to it. So it's really challenging in that regard, because the whole plan viabilities don't do what the NPPG, so the PPG requires, which is to set a baseline viable affordable housing threshold. So that kind of goes out the window. So you're then in a situation where you're trying to maintain something of an expectation, which delays the process, results in, there are a number of examples in London of refusals because they're not delivering against target levels. And there's a bit of a challenge going on with whether the community understands the likelihood of housing.
Just sort of add to that. I mean, I think up until now, when we've submitted viability appraisals on a number of sites now, I think most sites which are going in for planning now in London are being justified through maximum reasonable rather than through the threshold approach. But we provide evidence. I think the Mayor's SPP and Clean National Quality talked about having to provide evidence to justify your position. I've not, in my experience, ever been have to refer back to the evidence base of a local plan about why we're different from that. I think most planning authorities accept the evidence that you provided, it may be from independent surveyors or cost consultants, etc. I suppose what we're more nervous about is that it's in the PPGs at the moment, which sort of are slightly hidden. When it becomes into the NPPF, it may be given more weight. And I think it's about whether the decision maker could attach more weight to the local plan evidence-based position rather than the viability appraisal which is being made. But I have a lot of sympathy for local authorities in preparing evidence for a local plan, because when viability is changing on a daily basis at the moment. And I think provided that and actually most planning officers are very pragmatic about it, and they have independent assessors who will review the viability. So the system, it's not perfect, and Ben's point around transparency from politics and community, that can be challenging. But the system does kind of work, but I think it's just a plea really to ensure that the plan is flexible to address the viability challenges which we're facing.
Okay, well we'll come back to this afternoon. We're going to talk about the affordable housing requirements, and we'll have another session about what that means for viability in the round. I suppose going back to just say this now so that we get a chance to think about it over lunch. When we had the discussion on day one about viability, we talked about the evidence and some of the assumptions in it. And there was obviously some areas that, different views about they're cautious or they're optimistic or whatever. But the abnormal one did seem to be probably the biggest thing that varies on some sites. I mean, yeah, I think you're nodding, but we can check with the consultant this afternoon. But I mean, certainly that was a significant thing that could make a difference, because and there were reasons explained why no allowance is made for abnormals, because they can vary so much, but they could be hugely significant. I suppose one of the things is, well, they should affect the land value, not only the policy, but it's going to be a bit of both in reality, isn't it? It's going to come both ways. So I suppose going back to what the concern is here to think about is there anything in the plan that acknowledges that significant issue on the sites in Newham, that abnormal costs can be significant and they were not factored into the viability assessment? I suppose that's the point, isn't it?
That would be very helpful.
It is, and I think Simon says, that there are, you have the evidence base in front of you, and I think you mentioned this earlier, it's not necessarily about changing the evidence base, it's changing or updating the policy to reflect the existence, and no whole plan viability assessment is ever going to be able to assess every single site, which is a challenge. And that's why I think from our point of view, there are just quite simple changes to reflect it. One is a lot of the policies have just moved into this 50% strategic threshold. They don't, some policies don't even mention 35%, and they certainly don't give weight to the viability tested groups. So that almost diminishes down the policy hierarchy when it's absolutely fundamental to determination and application of policy. I think the other point is in our reps is, just having a paragraph, supporting paragraph that explains what the whole plan viability excludes. And because we're having these parallel conversations in Hounslow that I've mentioned, that the inspectors there have asked the local authority to set out as a topic paper, an update topic paper for the next sessions, a list of exclusions from the whole plan viability assessment. So obviously abnormal costs are identified, but it excludes civil taxation for the last 2 years. It excludes the building safety levy that's coming in, which is over there £60 a square metre. It includes the BS 999 fire requirements and stair court. So all of these things that actually diminish viability on a practical level. We're not quite sure how it's going to pan out, whether it's a supporting paragraph in the plan, but there will be a recognition that all of these things do need to be taken into account when you're applying the policy, and that they are excluded from the whole plan viability. So there is just an agreed position there, and we think that will be really helpful and transparent. It's also the slight issue that we have, I guess, is that the clients have to pay SIL. No one has exceptional circumstances relief anymore. Clients have to deliver stair courts. There's no getting around building safety levy. The indexation exists, the abnormal exists. So the only thing that ever gets dialed down is affordable housing. And the slight issue with that is it's always through a planning application, and then it's always seen that it's the applicant who is not to the public, they're not delivering the affordable housing expectations to the local authority. And that always creates, this is just a broader issue, but that creates a slightly negative optic in London. And that's to some extent why there is a degree of concern often when planning applications are submitted. So,
okay, look, I think we'll stop. We've strayed into this afternoon's agenda item away from this site specific, but that's understood, those points. I think the sort of things you talk about that are given and therefore affect the policy requirements, I think council would probably say, well, they should also affect the price you pay for land. It's not just one thing. But anyway, so yeah, you don't need to say anything now about any of that unless you want to.
Yeah, so we'll be discussing that at 2 o'clock today. Yeah. But just to let you know our response with regards to that, it represents a snapshot in time. If viability may improve, and we looked at it more strategically rather than a case site-by-site basis. And the policy is also subject to viability. So, if they put in an application and they want to deliver less than our policy requirement, it is subject to viability, so that there's that flexibility there. But yes, our consultant will be there at 2 o'clock to explain a bit.
Okay, right. So we'll right. Is there anything else on this side then? There's a couple of tweaks I think that I've itemised, which I'll look at. But in terms, just going back to what it means in terms of the overall supply, we've not got figures in the plan other than the modification to policy H1, which sets requirements based on capacity, and that's based on a particular trajectory that was done in the autumn, November, I think. Yeah. We've had some tweaks to that, but not all that much. This one being one. There's a couple of others about the timing in terms of the 5-year supply. So I'm wondering whether any of that needs to be reflected in H1 or not. Because the danger is every time a site, we have to draw a line somewhere. So I'll think about that. In terms of the 5-year supply, which is possibly more significant, this site, I think there was an allowance for some of it to be delivered in the 5-year.
No, not this gas works.
It wasn't.
Got permission yet.
Okay, so that never
Close
was.
to submit permission yet.
No.
Yeah.
So I think we discussed it, and it was, yeah, it would be optimistic, I think, was one of the things. Okay, so that wouldn't affect that. So the extent to which this capacity, as opposed to the 200 or whatever, affects the H1, okay, it's probably not that significant. And if there aren't any others, I think it's probably better to leave that where it is.
Sorry, sir. I just say, I think, one of the benefits of this site is that they are looking at a lot of high-risk buildings in terms of gateway 2. So there are some low-rise buildings. Just picking up on the 5-year point, it is. I always live in an optimistic world, but there is the potential that we could deliver some homes on this site within the first 5 years, not the full amount, but in the 5 years, first 5 years of the plan by 2031. That is something that we are looking at because timing would work for some of the low-rise buildings. We didn't have the same constraints for the gateway 2. So I just thought I'd flag that if it's the council, I don't know. But
no, I seem to recall we had this discussion when we talked about the allocation, and there was a suggestion that it could deliver in the first 5 years or not. But I suppose from our point of view, well, if the council hasn't assumed it, it's one of those examples of, well, okay, if the 5-year supply is assumed to be that, there are some sites that could deliver earlier or whatever, it provides some flexibility. It certainly doesn't put a limit on when you can bring it forward. Okay.
Sorry, can I just,
Yeah.
don't break something. Just two other points. So, in terms of, I don't think we're talking about a site again, which after stage should be.
I don't think so.
Which is fantastic. So thank you for that. So the first time that we will, and this is just because we're moving towards the planning application submission at the end of May. So the first time that we will get sight of your conclusions as to the route that we're going down will possibly be your report.
Well, no, I don't know. I think it'll be before that, because I think, as you probably realise, I've done action points throughout this.
Yeah.
I know this was I haven't made my mind up one yet.
Yes.
But I think, and there aren't many like that. I think those that are like that, I will try and provide clarity before my final report.
Right. So
at some point after this week, I'll do an action point of things, and then I'll probably do another one to sort of say, right, what happens next is council. We need to carry out consultation on the main modifications, and I'll be clear about what they are, and that'll set out what my thinking is. So if I think this site, this proposal in this allocation policy in the plan isn't sound, I've got choices, haven't I? One, just take it out, it's not there, or modify the plan to facilitate form of development that is sound, which you're saying this is subject to the mole release, and I think there's agreement on that. So that's an option before me. So yes, I think to answer your question, no, I will provide clarity before that.
thank you very much.
One way or another.
Thank you.
Sorry, just one
Yes.
minor comment that I think we spoke about previously. That I know you said there are a couple of mapping errors with the one that came out needed to map the site application in the mods, and one of them, as you said, was for the green space to carry through as it had previously across the MOL, including the part that's dedesignated. And then there was one small part of MOL, A24, I think, that wasn't carried,
through, so that, yeah.
Yeah, we spoke with Tyler that we've actually already done that day, but yeah, apologies for that. So yeah, we'll be adding that in.
So one of the things coming out of this is there will be a map that's produced. It won't be that, and it won't be that. It'll be
A bit of both.
tweak a bit of that. Okay, there's a bit of tweaking around. Fine. Okay. Anything else then this morning? In which case we'll break now and we're back at 2 o'clock for the affordable housing requirements, and we'll talk about liability and then any general performance issues and what happens next. Thank you.
Yeah.